China appears to be shaking up its power sector, aiming to reduce emissions from major pollutants in the industry by 60% by 2020. The announcement came as more than 190 countries gather in Paris to negotiate a binding climate agreement to limit the rise in global temperatures. Well, China is the world's biggest emitter. This week, we've seen the choking effects. So, to show you this picture here, this photograph taken in Beijing's Tiananmen Square on Tuesday. At its height, pollution climbed to 35 times World Health Organization safety levels. Have a look at the contrast here. The same location, 24 hours on. Blue skies above Beijing after a strong north wind has arrived to clear up the air. Well, let's get more on those Paris talks and speak to the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He's there in his current role as President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, New York, also authored a UN report on sustainability. Thanks for joining us on Impact. I mean, you, above all, perhaps know the perils and toxicity of pledging to climate change green policies. I mean, many would say it cost you your career in the end. What's different this time?
Well, I don't think that's accurate at all. We introduced mandatory renewable energy targets, a range of other measures, price on carbon, and we actually brought down Australian emissions by 7 to 10% in the period that we were in office. So politics is a different matter. But this is a complex negotiation here in Paris. And we do not know what the final outcome would be, but if I was to give you a general summation, it would be that there is a 6 or 7 out of 10 chance of this becoming a substantive, legally binding agreement. Lots of obstacles on the road, but I do think the prospects are vastly improved on what they were when we were in Copenhagen 5 or 6 years ago. OK, and would it have been different, do you think, for you had there been that sort of consensus when you were at Copenhagen? And I don't want to spend the whole interview arguing about your political career, but many of your critics would suggest that you moved from renewables because politically it was impossible, and you tried to switch the agenda, and as such were criticised for it. Well, as far as Copenhagen was concerned, we in Australia had global responsibilities, not just national responsibilities. Nationally, we acted on climate change. As I said, the numbers are there to see themselves. Australian greenhouse gas emissions came down. But in terms of global action, that's more important. Australia represents 1.3% of total global emissions. What's changed in the last 5 or 6 years? It's probably in about 5 letters, C-H-I-N-A, China. Yeah, and the Chinese government's radically changed its posture. And this is why I want to discuss with you now, because, I mean, in Copenhagen, again, I mean, you used a very choice phrase, which I could certainly not repeat on television, about how the Chinese decided to negotiate in the dying days of that Copenhagen thing, which I'll leave viewers to leave to their imagination. But is that the reason, is that the point? China basically has changed out of self-interest, that it knows it's the biggest emitter. It's got to do something about it now. Well, let's just face a few facts here. Number one is that China is now the world's largest emitter, and therefore, if you're going to have them out of the game, well, frankly, we may as well give up the game. But now that they are in with a 180-degree shift in their policy positions driven by the domestic imperatives, you mentioned before in the introduction, the problems arising from carbon pollution or air pollution in Beijing and the other major cities. They're also seeing the evidence of climate change as well in terms of water scarcity. So China, for national interest reasons, is acting. That's good news for the rest of the world. And we're seeing China adopt a much more constructive position on the core outstanding disagreements in this draft Paris Agreement on climate change, which still has 10 days' worth of negotiations ahead of it. Do you understand India's argument, though, that India needs to catch up in terms of the developed world? You know, 30% of the Indian population still doesn't have electricity, that you need to allow countries like India to develop, and they should be given certain dispensations. I have a lot of sympathy for our Indian friends. My new position with the Asia Society Policy Institute, I've been in Delhi probably 3 times this year, speaking to the government about climate change action. And the truth is, India is about 30 years behind China in the industrial development process, which means there's a large lump of potential intensive carbon-based industrial expansion ahead of it unless we act in support of our friends in India. So the key thing here is to make sure we don't say to India, keep your people in poverty. That's unsustainable and unjust. 2, when it comes to the coal requirements which India faces for the future, to do what we can in key technologies like carbon capture and storage and cleaner coal to reduce their carbon footprint to what it would otherwise be. But critically, for the hundreds of millions of people who are currently not on the electricity grid at all, as you mentioned, to use local solar plants to provide them with the opportunities for electricity and lighting which they don't have, with a negligible carbon imprint. And that's where we've got to work with India, not against India.
We've only got a few seconds left, really. I mean, is this conference a potential game changer? Is a deal within reach, as Francois Hollande said at the opening? And certainly you've got President Obama, who seems committed to doing as much as he can, although he's got a hostile Congress back at home.
Well, the Congress back home will look at the question of whether the United States should be entering into treaty arrangements. What I'd say to the American audience and the congressional audience is simply this. When you have an opportunity like this with a Paris Agreement on climate change, it brings all countries together to act in a manner which brings down greenhouse gas emissions and leaves us with the prospect by century's end of keeping temperature increases within 2 degrees centigrade. If you look at what's happening in California in terms of intense droughts at the moment, I'd be looking carefully at that. But here's the other point on the legal regime. Remember, these negotiations in Paris occur within the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which in 1992 was negotiated by George Bush Sr., signed by George Bush Sr., and ratified by George Bush Sr. This Paris Agreement occurs within the framework of a treaty already ratified. And so therefore, this legally binding arrangement that we're going to negotiate in Paris should not be seen as some sort of wild, novel legal experiment from the perspective of the United States Congress.
All right. OK, on that note, Kevin Rudd, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on Impact.